Bienvenidos a Historias Entrevidas. Refugio Ontiveros knocked on the door of the last house on the road, his younger daughter asleep on his shoulder, his son gripping the hem of his shirt, and he didn't knock the way a man knocks when he's got somewhere else to go. The evening had settled thick and gray over the hills outside San Sebastián del Llamo, in the highlands of Jalisco. And the woman who opened the door held her lamp a little higher, studying the three of them the way you'd study weather that might turn. She hadn't said a word yet. Refugio's hands were shaking, though he told himself it was only the cold. 9 days earlier, the landlord who owned the little rented house at the edge of town had nailed a notice to Refugio's door announcing that the property had been sold and that all tenants had until the end of the month to leave. Refugio had gone to the man in person, hat in hand, explaining that he had 2 children and a job mending harnesses that barely covered food, that he needed more time. Even a few weeks. The landlord, a heavy-set man named Prudencio Beltran, who had never once in 3 years asked after the children by name, told him flatly that business was business, and that sentiment didn't pay debts. When Refugio pressed once more, mentioning that his daughter had been born in that house, that his wife had died in the back room not 2 years past, Beltran only shrugged and said that plenty of people had sad stories, and that if he let every tenant with a sad story stay rent-free, he'd be the one out on the road himself by winter. Word of the eviction spread through town fast, the way it does in small places, and more than one neighbor who used to wave at Refugio from across the plaza started finding reasons to look somewhere else when he passed. A widowed father raising 2 children alone had always drawn a certain kind of pity in San Sebastián, the kind that costs nothing and helps no one. His daughter Consuelo was 5 and didn't fully understand why they were leaving, only that her father kept the good blanket wrapped around her shoulders even when it wasn't cold. The one with patches sewn into one corner and stitches too fine to be his own, the same blanket her mother had made before she died, bringing Consuelo into the world. His son, Emiliano, was 8, old enough to have heard the ugly comments some of the boys' fathers made about that Ontiveros man, still can't get on his feet, and young enough that the words still cut clean through him every time. The last morning in the house, Refugio had stood in the empty front room, looking at the marks on the wall where his wife had once hung a small framed picture, and allowed himself exactly 1 minute of grief before he picked up the children's things and walked out the door without looking back. They had nowhere fixed to go. Refugio's own parents were long dead, his wife's family scattered to a city he'd never been to, and the small savings he had would barely cover a week's lodging, let alone a month's. He had asked quietly at 2 other houses along the road before this one, and both times the answer had come back the same. Sympathetic words, and a door that stayed only halfway open, never quite an invitation. He'd heard from an old customer at the harness shop that there was a widow living alone out past the arroyo, in a stone cottage that had belonged to her family for generations, a woman named Doa Herminia Casillas, who kept mostly to herself since her only daughter had passed some years before. The customer didn't know much else about her, only that she was known in town as being kind to strangers passing through, if a little private about her own life. It was the only door Refugio had left to knock on, and by the time he reached it, the last of the daylight had already gone out of the sky. Doa Herminia held the lamp up a moment longer before she finally spoke. "You're the harness maker's boy. Ontiveros, it wasn't a question." Refugio nodded and found, to his own surprise, that his voice failed him entirely. So it was Emiliano who spoke instead, tugging at his father's sleeve. "My sister's never had a grandmother," the boy said, plain as anything a child says when he hasn't yet learned to dress the truth up. "Neither have I. Pap says we don't have anybody. Please, Ciora, can we stay just tonight?" Consuelo stirred against her father's shoulder but didn't wake. the patched blanket slipping a little off one small shoulder. Doa Herminia looked at the boy for a long moment, something crossing her face that Refugio couldn't quite name, not quite surprise, not quite sorrow, something closer to recognition, and then she stepped back from the doorway. "One night," she said. "We'll talk about tomorrow. Tomorrow. Come in out of the cold before that little one catches something." Refugio hesitated on the threshold only a second longer. Some old instinct telling him a man shouldn't accept charity so easily from a stranger, before Emiliano's small hand found his and pulled him forward. Inside, the warmth of the house hit him first, then the smell of wood smoke, and he felt, for the first time in 9 days, something in his shoulders loosen just slightly. The way a rope loosens when the weight on it finally shifts. What Refugio didn't know, standing on that threshold with his children half asleep and his pride worn through at the elbows, was that Doa Herminia had buried a daughter of her own many years before, and that something in the shape of this small, ragged family standing in her doorway had already cracked something open in her that she'd kept sealed shut a long, long time. The cottage was small but warm, smelling of dried rosemary and the banked coals of a fire that had been burning most of the day. Doa Herminia set out a plate of beans and a few tortillas without being asked twice whether the children were hungry, and Consuelo, waking just enough to eat, watched the old woman with the frank curiosity that only small children can get away with. Emiliano ate slowly, watching his father's face for some sign of what came next, the way children of hard years learn to read their parents like weather. Refugio ate almost nothing. He kept glancing at the door, half certain that at any moment Doa Herminia would remember herself and ask them to leave. She didn't. She made up a pallet by the fire for the children out of an old quilt, and gave Refugio a stool near the hearth, and when Consuelo, half dreaming already, mumbled something about wanting her mother, Doa Herminia was the one who answered, before Refugio could gather himself to. "Your mam is watching over you tonight, Mija. Same as always. God keep her. Close your eyes." Refugio looked at her sharply, something tightening in his throat, but the old woman only busied herself banking the fire, as though she hadn't said anything worth remarking on. In the morning, Doa Herminia was up before any of them, and the smell of coffee and fresh masa filled the small house. She said nothing about them leaving. Instead, she set Emiliano to fetching water and showed Consuelo how to pat a tortilla properly between her small hands, patient with the girl's clumsy first attempts in a way that suggested long practice, though there had been no children in this house for years. Refugio, watching from the doorway, offered to fix the loose hinge on her gate before he left to look for work in town, and Doa Herminia said only, "There's no hurry. The hinge has waited this long." It was the closest thing to an invitation either of them had said aloud. A neighbor woman, passing on the road with a basket of laundry, paused at the fence to ask, with poorly hidden curiosity, whether Doa Herminia had taken in boarders. The old woman answered simply that she had guests for a few days, and the neighbor went on her way, though not without a glance back at the children playing near the gate that Refugio didn't miss. He understood, without being told, that his family's situation would be a subject of conversation in town whether he liked it or not, the way any hardship becomes public property in a small place. That evening, over supper, Doa Herminia mentioned, without much weight to it, that she'd heard from the neighbor that Prudencio Beltran, the landlord, had already re-rented the house Refugio's family had vacated, at nearly double what Refugio had been paying, to a family from out of town who had more money and fewer questions. The days settled into something that almost felt, to Refugio's own surprise, like a rhythm. He found 2 days' work a week mending harness and tack for a rancher outside town, enough to buy flour and a little meat, and every evening he came back to find his children fed, calmer. sleeping easier than they had in the weeks since the eviction notice went up. Doa Herminia began teaching Consuelo to sew, the girl's small stitches wandering and uneven at first, done with a spool of thread from a small tin box the old woman kept on a shelf near the window, alongside old buttons and bits of ribbon that looked like they'd been saved for decades. Emiliano, still wary of trusting anything that felt too good, watched his father's face each night for signs of worry, and each night found a little less of it there than the night before. Each morning followed nearly the same shape, Doa Herminia up first, coffee on before the children stirred, Consuelo padding into the kitchen still half asleep to sit at the old woman's feet while she cooked. Emiliano out at the well before breakfast to fetch water without being asked twice after the first week. By the second week, Consuelo had stopped asking, each night, whether they would still be there in the morning. By the third, she had started calling Doa Herminia Abuela without anyone teaching her the word, the syllables slipping out one evening over supper as naturally as if she'd always known them. And the old woman's hands had gone still over her plate for a long moment, before she answered, quietly, that yes, Mija, that would do just fine. One evening, Consuelo, exploring the house the way children do when they've stopped being afraid of a place, pulled the patched blanket from her mother tight around her shoulders and asked Doa Herminia, with the bluntness only a 5-year-old can manage, why she lived alone if she liked children so much. The old woman's hands stilled over her sewing for a moment. I had a daughter, she said finally. She would have been near your pap's age now if she'd lived. She didn't say more that night, and Refugio, overhearing from the next room, felt something in his chest tighten with a grief that wasn't quite his own, but wasn't entirely separate from it either. Around that same week, an older neighbor named Doa Filomena, who had known Doa Herminia since they were both girls, stopped by unannounced with a sack of dried chiles and a bundle of herbs, saying only that she'd heard there were more mouths to feed in the house now, and that a woman shouldn't have to stretch her own garden thinner on account of hospitality. She stayed long enough to watch Consuelo's uneven stitches with an approving nod and to tell Emiliano, only half in jest, that a boy who fetched water without complaint would make some rancher a fine hand someday. It was a small visit, over almost as soon as it began, but Refugio noticed that Doa Herminia's shoulders sat a little lighter after the door closed behind her old friend, as though some worry she hadn't spoken aloud had been quietly set down. What Doa Herminia was about to find, tucked away where she hadn't looked in years, was something neither she nor Refugio had ever imagined. It happened almost 2 weeks after they'd arrived, on a Sunday when Doa Herminia decided, for reasons she couldn't fully explain even to herself, to clean out an old trunk that had belonged to her daughter, untouched since the girl's death. Dust rose off the lid when Refugio helped her carry it out to the patio, and for a moment the old woman simply sat with her hand resting on the wood, gathering the nerve to open something she'd avoided for years. Refugio offered to leave her to it, but she shook her head and asked him to stay, saying that some things were easier to face with another person nearby, even a near stranger. Inside were folded dresses gone soft and yellowed at the creases, a few photographs curling at the corners, a rosary with beads worn smooth from handling, and near the bottom, wrapped in an old shawl, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon that had once been blue. Doa Herminia's hands stilled over one letter in particular, still sealed, tucked separately into the lining of the shawl as though it had been kept apart from the others on purpose. The letter was addressed, in her daughter's handwriting, to a name Refugio recognized instantly, and with a jolt that stole the breath clean out of him, his late wife's given name, followed by her maiden surname. He had to steady himself against the edge of the trunk. Doa Herminia, confused by the look on his face, unfolded the letter with unsteady fingers and read aloud, haltingly, A letter her daughter had written some 15 years earlier to a dear friend from her school days in the city. A friend she called the sister I chose, since I never had one of my own. The letter went on for 2 full pages, full of small confidences, in jokes Doa Herminia couldn't follow, and near the end, a line that made her voice catch, her daughter writing that she hoped, whatever life brought either of them, they would find their way back to each other someday, even if only through their children. Doa Herminia's hands trembled as she looked up at Refugio, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "Your wife," she said slowly, "was my daughter's dearest friend. She wrote to me about her for years, before I ever knew her name, before either of you ever set foot in this town." She went digging further through the bundle and found 2 more letters, both in the same hand, both addressed to the same name, and in one of them dated only a year before her daughter's death, a mention of her sweet Refugio, the harness maker's apprentice up in the hills, who she says looks at her like she hung the moon herself. Refugio, his own eyes wet now, understood all at once why something in Doa Herminia's face had softened toward his children from the very first night, in a way that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with a thread neither of them had known was still connecting them. It didn't take long for the rest of the town to hear that the widow Casillas had taken in the harness maker and his children, and that some old connection had turned up between her family and the children's late mother. Prudencio Beltran, the landlord, hearing that Refugio had found not just shelter, but something that looked increasingly like a home, made the mistake of remarking, within earshot of several townspeople at the market, that some men had a talent for landing on soft ground, no matter how little they deserved it. Doa Herminia heard about the comment before the day was out, carried to her by the same laundry basket neighbor who'd first asked about boarders. She said nothing to Refugio about it that evening, but the following Sunday, at the small church in the plaza, Prudencio Beltran himself approached her after Mass, greeting her with his usual empty courtesy, perhaps expecting the polite silence she generally kept for people she didn't care to speak with. Instead, Doa Herminia held her ground on the church steps, in full view of half the congregation still filing out behind her. "Don Prudencio," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "I hear you've been saying that the harness maker has a talent for landing on soft ground he doesn't deserve." Beltran's smile faltered, and he began some reply about only having meant it in good humor. But Doa Herminia didn't let him finish. "You rented that family's home to strangers for nearly double the price the moment it stood empty, and you called that business. I've taken this family into my own house for nothing at all, and I call that family. I wonder which of us this town will remember more kindly, years from now, when it's telling stories about the both of us." A small crowd had gathered without quite meaning to, the way crowds do outside a church on a Sunday, and several people nearby had clearly caught every word. Beltran, red to the collar, opened his mouth once more, seemed to think better of whatever he'd been about to say, and excused himself rather quickly, muttering something about an appointment that fooled no one. One of the older men from the plaza, a retired schoolteacher who had known both families for decades, said, not quite under his breath, that he'd wondered for years when someone was finally going to say that to Beltran's face. Doa Herminia didn't answer him, only gathered Consuelo's hand in her own and walked on toward home, her back straight the entire way. Refugio, standing a little apart with the children, said nothing during any of it, but he didn't need to. Emiliano looked up at him with something like the beginning of pride, an expression Refugio hadn't seen on his son's face since before the eviction notice went up on their door. That evening, as they walked back along the road past the arroyo, Emiliano asked his father, in the plain, unguarded way of an 8-year-old, whether they were going to live with Doa Herminia forever now. Refugio didn't have an answer yet, not one he trusted enough to say out loud. But for the first time in months, the not knowing didn't frighten him the way it once had. Months passed, and by the time the rains came again to the highlands, nobody in San Sebastian del Llamo spoke of the Ontiveros children as the poor harness makers' orphans anymore. The little stone cottage past the arroyo had a new coat of whitewash on it. Paid for in part by steady work, Refugio had finally found repairing tack for 3 ranches instead of 1. And in part by an old woman's insistence that a house with children in it deserved to look like it. That Sunday afternoon, half the road seemed to have found its way to Doa Herminia's patio, drawn by nothing more than an open invitation and the smell of tamales steaming since morning, corn husks stacked in a basket by the door, and the low murmur of women's voices in the kitchen trading recipes and gossip in equal measure. Someone had brought a guitar, and an old man Refugio barely knew was tuning it badly in the shade of the fig tree while children chased each other around the well. Consuelo, in a dress with careful, even stitching she'd sewn almost entirely herself, ran laughing between the legs of neighbors who, months before, had found reasons not to look at her father in the plaza. Emiliano sat close beside Doa Herminia, showing her, with real pride, a knot he'd learned to tie at the harness shop, and the old woman admired it with the seriousness the boy's effort deserved, turning it over in her hands like it was fine embroidery. The rosary that had hung by Doa Herminia's door for as long as anyone in town could remember still hung there, but now it shared the wall with a small drawing Consuelo had made, of a house with 4 stick figures standing in front of it, and a 5th, smaller one drawn as a dog that didn't exist, because every child's drawing of home needs one more living thing in it than the family actually has. Refugio found a quiet moment beside her as the afternoon light went gold over the hills. "I keep thinking," he said, "that if Beltran hadn't thrown us out, I never would have knocked on this door, never would have known what my wife meant to your daughter, or what your family had already been to mine before either of us knew it. First God, I suppose, knew it all along." Doa Herminia patted his hand, the same patched blanket that had once wrapped a frightened little girl, now folded neatly across the back of a chair on the patio, a fixture of the house rather than the last thing a family owned. "If God wills it, that blanket stays folded on that chair a good long while yet," she said, watching these two grow up under a roof that finally fits them. Sometimes the truest home isn't the one we're given. It's the one we find our way to, one door at a time, when we've got nowhere else left to knock. Sometimes the truest home isn't the one waiting for us where we started, but the one we stumble toward when every other door has already closed. Sometimes the family we were missing was only ever a knock away, waiting on the other side of a stranger's porch light. Have you ever found a home in the last place you expected to look for one? If this story reached something in you, leave a comment and let us know what part of Mexico or wherever in the world you're watching from. We'd love for you to subscribe to Historias Entre Vidas so you never miss the next one. And if it touched you, share it with someone who's ever felt like they had nowhere left to knock. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. And in San Sebastian del Llamo, people still say that on quiet Sunday afternoons, you can hear children laughing behind the whitewashed walls of the old Casillas cottage, and that the door there has never once, since that night, been closed to anyone who truly needed it.